somewhere in the span between April and November of 2025, a material most people have never heard of became the centerpiece of the largest geopolitical chess match of the decade. These 17 elements scattered across the periodic table don't make headlines the way oil or gold do. Their names sound like entries from a chemistry exam most of us forgot to study for. Neodymium, praseodymium, dysprosium, terbium. Try saying those 5 times fast. But while the world was busy watching tariff negotiations and summit handshakes, these elements were quietly rewriting the rules of global power. This isn't a story about mining or metallurgy, though those play a role. This is about leverage, about how a single country spent 4 decades building a fortress around materials that power everything from the smartphone in your pocket to the missile defense systems protecting entire continents. And in 2025, China reminded the world that this fortress has doors, and those doors can close whenever Beijing decides the moment is right. The comparison to oil is not accidental. For most of the 20th century, whoever controlled petroleum controlled industrial civilization. Wars were fought over it, economies rose and fell with its price, and entire regions became geopolitically indispensable because crude happened to pool beneath their deserts. But we're now watching a transition, not from oil to nothing, but from oil to something more concentrated, more strategically vital, and far harder to replace. Rare earth elements are that something, and unlike oil, which at least exists in multiple regions, even if OPEC dominated pricing, rare earths in their refined, usable form flow through a single node. That node is China. Specifically, it's the processing facilities in Inner Mongolia's Baotou region and the separation plants scattered across southern provinces where the real transformation happens, where raw ore becomes the precision materials that make modern technology possible. Understanding what happened in 2025 requires understanding how we arrived at this moment. This isn't a story that starts with an announcement from China's Ministry of Commerce. It starts decades earlier, with strategic decisions made when most Western nations were either unaware or unconcerned that concentration in critical minerals processing could become a geopolitical weapon. Act 1 of this story spans roughly 1980 through 2025, a 45-year period during which China methodically constructed the rare earth empire that now gives it extraordinary leverage over global manufacturing and defense supply chains. In the early 1980s, China's leader Deng Xiaoping reportedly declared that the Middle East has oil and China has rare earths. This wasn't mere rhetoric. It was the opening move in a multi-decade strategy to dominate an industry that Western companies were actively abandoning. At that time, the United States was actually the world's leading rare earth producer. The Mountain Pass, mine in California, operated by what was then Molycorp, produced the majority of global supply. American metallurgists understood rare earth processing. American factories used rare earth magnets. The technology wasn't exotic or foreign, but rare earth processing is messy, expensive, and environmentally complicated. Extracting these elements from ore requires aggressive chemical processes that generate toxic waste. Refining them to the purity levels needed for high-performance magnets demands sophisticated separation techniques that took decades to perfect. During the 1980s and 1990s, as environmental regulations tightened in developed nations and labor costs rose, Chinese state-owned enterprises began offering rare earths at prices Western producers simply couldn't match. This wasn't market competition in the traditional sense. Chinese companies, backed by state subsidies and operating with minimal environmental oversight, could afford to sell rare earths below cost. They did this deliberately, understanding that Western competitors operating on market principles would eventually exit the industry. And exit they did. Mountain Pass closed in 2002 after a series of wastewater spills and mounting regulatory pressure. Australian operations scaled back. European processing facilities shuttered. By the mid-2000s, China controlled approximately 90% of global rare earth production. But the real dominance wasn't in mining, it was in refining. Even rare earths mined in other countries often had to be shipped to China for processing because the separation facilities, the expertise, and the integrated supply chains existed nowhere else at scale. This created a choke point that would become increasingly strategic as the 21st century progressed. The world got its first clear warning of what this concentration meant in 2010. That September, a Chinese fishing trawler collided with Japanese Coast Guard vessels near the disputed Senkaku Islands, which China calls the Diaoyu Islands. Japan detained the trawler's captain. In response, China quietly halted rare earth exports to Japan. The embargo was never officially announced, but shipments stopped. Within weeks, rare earth prices spiked. Japanese manufacturers, particularly in the automotive and electronics sectors, faced immediate supply disruptions. Toyota, Honda, Panasonic, these companies suddenly couldn't access materials essential for hybrid vehicle motors, precision optics, and consumer electronics. The message was unmistakable. China could turn off the tap, and when it did, entire industries would grind to a standstill. That 2010 crisis prompted Japan to invest heavily in supply chain diversification. Japanese trading companies poured money into Australian mining projects. The government established strategic stockpiles. By 2020, Japan had successfully reduced its dependence on Chinese rare earth imports from 90% to around 70%, which was progress but still left Tokyo vulnerable. More importantly, even Japanese diversification efforts revealed a hard truth. You could find rare earths elsewhere, but refining them to usable purity without Chinese processing capacity remained extraordinarily difficult. Throughout the 2010s, China continued consolidating domestic control. In 2015, the government mandated that China's fragmented rare earth industry consolidate into 6 major state-affiliated groups. By 2021, this was further concentrated into essentially 2 supergiants: Northern Rare Earth controlling light rare earth production and China Rare Earth Group dominating heavy rare earths. This wasn't just corporate restructuring, it was vertical integration designed to give Beijing direct oversight of production quotas, export volumes, and pricing. The Chinese government could now coordinate rare earth policy with the same precision that OPEC once coordinated oil output, except with even greater concentration of control. During this same period, global demand for rare earths was exploding. The push toward electrification, driven by climate policy and technological advancement, made rare earth permanent magnets absolutely essential. Electric vehicle motors, particularly those designed for high performance and efficiency, rely on neodymium iron boron magnets. A single Tesla Model 3 uses roughly 1 kilogram of neodymium and about 200 grams of dysprosium. Wind turbines, especially the direct drive generators favoured for offshore installations, require even larger quantities. A single 12 megawatt offshore wind turbine can contain up to 4 tons of rare earth magnets. Defence applications are equally dependent. An F-35 fighter jet contains more than 400 kilograms of rare earth materials. Virginia-class submarines use rare earth magnets in sonar systems. Precision-guided munitions rely on rare earth elements for guidance and propulsion systems. The Pentagon understood by the mid-2010s that America's ability to manufacture advanced weapons systems depended on a supply chain controlled by a strategic rival. Western governments began talking about rare earth independence. The US Department of Defense funded domestic projects. Australia positioned itself as an alternative supplier. But talk and funding don't immediately translate to operational refining capacity. Building a rare earth separation facility requires massive capital investment, access to expertise that China had spent decades developing, and willingness to handle environmental challenges that had driven Western companies out of the industry in the first place. As of 2020, despite growing concern about supply chain vulnerability, China still processed approximately 85% of the world's rare earths and manufactured 94% of rare earth permanent magnets. Which brings us to 2025, the year China decided to formalize what had been implicit leverage into explicit control through the most comprehensive rare earth export restrictions ever implemented. The escalation began in early 2025, amid broader trade tensions between Washington and Beijing. In April, China's Ministry of Commerce announced export controls on 7 heavy rare earth elements, including dysprosium and terbium, the 2 elements most critical for high-performance magnets that must operate at extreme temperatures. These aren't just valuable rare earths, they are irreplaceable rare earths for certain applications. Heavy rare earths, unlike their lighter cousins, are geologically concentrated in southern China's ionic clay deposits, which allow for economically viable extraction through simple leaching processes. Hard rock deposits containing heavy rare earths exist in Canada, Sweden, and Australia, but extracting them requires aggressive acid digestion and complex processing that makes production costs dramatically higher than Chinese ionic clay operations. The April restrictions required exporters to obtain licenses before shipping controlled materials. In practice, this gave Beijing the ability to throttle supply by simply delaying license approvals, a tactic China employed with calculated precision. American and European manufacturers found themselves waiting weeks or months for permits that might or might not arrive. Some automotive plants in the United States and Germany reported production slowdowns as magnet supplies ran thin. Prices spiked. Dysprosium oxide, which had traded around $250 per kilogram before the restrictions, jumped to over $350 within weeks. In European markets, prices reached 6 times Chinese domestic levels, creating a bifurcated global market where Western manufacturers paid premium rates for materials that Chinese competitors accessed at lower cost. Then came October 9, 2025, when China unveiled Announcement Number 61, the most far-reaching rare earth control measure in history. This wasn't just about restricting exports of raw materials. It expanded the controlled list to include 12 rare earth elements, added restrictions on processing equipment and technologies, and most significantly, applied a foreign direct product rule modeled on export controls the United States had long used against Chinese technology companies. Under this rule, any product manufactured anywhere in the world that contained even 0.1% by value of Chinese origin rare earths, or that was produced using Chinese rare earth technologies, would require a Chinese export license if sold internationally. This effectively globalized Beijing's regulatory reach. A magnet manufacturer in Europe sourcing partially from Chinese materials would need Chinese government approval before selling to customers in Japan or the United States. The implications were staggering. China wasn't just controlling what left its borders, it was asserting jurisdiction over the global rare earth supply chain. The announcement came one day before Presidents Xi Jinping and Donald Trump were scheduled to meet in South Korea. The timing was no accident. China was demonstrating leverage ahead of trade negotiations, showing that it held cards Western nations couldn't easily counter. The foreign direct product rule, in particular, mirrored tactics Washington had used to restrict semiconductor sales to Chinese companies. But now Beijing was turning the same weapon around, targeting industries where China held the dominant position. For about 3 weeks, global markets absorbed the shock. Automotive companies scrambled. Defense contractors worried about production delays. Then, on November 7th, China announced a temporary suspension of these expanded controls, citing the need to ensure the security and stability of global industrial and supply chains. The suspension would last until November 2026, effectively hitting pause on the most aggressive measures. This came after Trump and Xi met in Seoul and reached what was described as a trade framework that included tariff reductions on both sides. China lifted the export controls that had not yet taken effect, meaning the foreign direct product rule and the expanded list of controlled elements, while keeping in place the licensing system for certain heavy rare earths and magnets that had been operating since April. Here's what this sequence reveals about Beijing's strategy. The October announcement was a demonstration of capability, a signal that China could, if it chose, bring Western manufacturing to its knees by restricting access to materials essential for electric vehicles, renewable energy, defense systems, and consumer electronics. The November suspension was Beijing showing restraint, proving it could ease pressure as part of diplomatic negotiations. But the underlying leverage remained. The licensing system stayed in place. China retained the legal framework to reimpose broader controls at any time. And Western companies received a very clear message: your supply chains depend on Chinese goodwill. This is informational statecraft, a concept that recent academic research has begun to explore in depth. China doesn't need to actually cut off rare earth exports to achieve strategic objectives. The threat of doing so, the uncertainty about whether licenses will be approved, the knowledge that tighter controls could return at any moment, these factors alone reshape behavior. Companies make investment decisions based on risk assessment. When access to critical materials becomes uncertain, manufacturers start paying premiums for alternative supplies. Governments pour money into domestic capacity that may not be economically competitive, and strategic calculations in boardrooms and defense ministries shift. China gains leverage not by strangling supply, but by demonstrating that it could. The threat is the weapon. So that's how we got here. 45 years of deliberate strategy by Beijing to dominate rare earth processing, punctuated by a 2010 warning shot against Japan, followed by accelerating demand from electrification and defense applications, culminating in 2025 with China formalizing its control through the most comprehensive export restrictions ever implemented before strategically easing them to demonstrate flexibility. The fortress is built, the gates can close, and the rest of the world is now fully aware of it. Now let's examine who actually feels the pain when China tightens rare earth access. The answer is more complex and more widespread than most people realize, because rare earth elements sit at critical nodes in multiple supply chains, and disruptions ripple outward in ways that aren't immediately obvious. Start with electric vehicles, the sector where rare earth dependence is most visible and most concerning for Western automotive giants trying to transition away from internal combustion engines. Every high-performance electric vehicle motor uses neodymium iron-boron permanent magnets. These magnets offer the best combination of power density, efficiency, and durability currently available. Some EV manufacturers have explored alternatives like induction motors, which Tesla uses in some of its models, but permanent magnet motors still dominate the market because they deliver better range and performance. Industry forecasts suggest that even with continued research into magnet-free designs, rare earth permanent magnet motors will maintain more than 70% market share in electric drive systems through at least 2035. When China restricted heavy rare earth exports in April 2025, European automakers felt immediate pressure. BMW, Mercedes, and Volkswagen all source magnets from suppliers who depend on Chinese rare earth materials. Production didn't stop, not immediately, but procurement teams scrambled to secure inventory. Some companies reported that magnet suppliers increased prices by 20 to 30% within a month. For automakers operating on thin margins as they invest billions in electrification infrastructure, these cost increases erode profitability. More concerning, the uncertainty about future access complicates long-term production planning. How do you commit to manufacturing 5 million electric vehicles annually by 2030 when the magnet supply chain could be disrupted at Beijing's discretion? This uncertainty itself becomes a strategic weapon. The wind energy sector faces similar exposure, but with even less flexibility. Offshore wind turbines, which represent the fastest growing segment of renewable energy capacity, overwhelmingly use direct drive permanent magnet generators. These generators eliminate gearboxes, reducing mechanical complexity and maintenance requirements critical for turbines located miles offshore in harsh marine environments. But this design choice creates intense rare earth dependence. A single offshore turbine requires 4 tons of neodymium iron-boron magnets. Europe has committed to installing hundreds of gigawatts of offshore wind capacity by 2050 as part of its climate goals. The math is brutal. If China restricts rare earth magnet exports, European wind developers can't hit their targets. American offshore wind projects, which are years behind Europe, face the same constraint. The US Energy Department's Acting Assistant Secretary for International Affairs put it bluntly at a conference in London In 2025, there are no wind turbines without concession to or coercion from China. Defense applications present the most acute national security concern. The Pentagon uses rare earth elements across virtually every advanced weapons system. Jet engines rely on samarium cobalt magnets that maintain performance at extreme temperatures. Missile guidance systems use rare earth-doped lasers for targeting. Radar installations depend on rare earth phosphors for display systems. Electronic warfare equipment uses rare earth magnets in precision actuators. An F-35 fighter, America's most advanced stealth aircraft, contains over 400 kilograms of rare earth materials. The Navy's new Columbia-class ballistic missile submarines, the backbone of America's nuclear deterrent, use rare earth magnets in propulsion systems and sonar arrays. China's October 2025 announcement included language specifying that export licenses would, in principle, be denied for military end users and entities on Beijing's control list. This means China reserves the right to refuse rare earth sales to defense contractors at any time. The strategic vulnerability here isn't just about current production, it's about surge capacity. If the United States needed to rapidly scale up weapons production, as would be required in a major conflict, that surge depends on access to rare earth magnets and materials. Stockpiles exist, but they're measured in months of supply, not years. Building domestic rare earth processing capacity takes time measured in years, even with unlimited funding. During those years, American defense production would remain dependent on a strategic competitor that might be the very nation US forces are confronting. Semiconductors represent another pressure point, though the connection to rare earths is less direct and more about related critical materials like gallium and germanium, which China also controls. In 2025, China expanded export restrictions to include high-purity silicon used in semiconductor manufacturing. The rare earth connection comes through the entire ecosystem of advanced materials that modern chip production requires. Lanthanum is used in specialty glasses for photolithography equipment. Cerium oxide is essential for chemical-mechanical polishing of silicon wafers. Yttrium is used in some laser systems for chip fabrication. While these applications don't consume large volumes, they sit at critical technical bottlenecks. If China restricts access, semiconductor manufacturers can't easily substitute alternatives. Consumer electronics, the sector where rare earths first gained prominence, continues to absorb significant quantities hard. Disk drives use neodymium magnets in voice coil motors. Smartphone vibration motors use tiny rare earth magnets. Laptop speakers, camera autofocus systems, noise-cancelling headphones all rely on rare earth magnets because they deliver performance in compact form factors. Apple, Samsung, and other major manufacturers source components from Asian suppliers who depend on Chinese rare earth materials. When China tightened controls in 2025, electronics manufacturers didn't see immediate supply disruptions because they maintain inventory buffers and their magnet requirements are smaller than automotive or wind applications. But longer term, if restrictions persist, either costs increase or manufacturers redesign products to use less efficient alternative technologies. Now consider the second-order effects, the ripples that spread beyond direct rare earth consumers. When automotive companies pay higher prices for magnets, those costs eventually flow through to vehicle prices. Electric vehicles are already more expensive than comparable internal combustion models, partly due to battery costs. Adding rare earth cost pressures makes EVs less competitive, which slows adoption, which makes it harder for countries to meet emissions reduction targets. Wind energy projects operate on similar economics. If magnet costs rise significantly, the levelized cost of electricity from offshore wind increases, making projects less attractive to developers and harder to finance. Climate goals and rare earth vulnerability are directly linked. Western nations have committed to aggressive decarbonization timelines that depend on technologies which require Chinese-controlled materials. Beijing is aware of this dependency. Defense industrial base resilience also hinges on rare earths in ways that extend beyond weapons systems. modern military communication relies on satellites which use rare earth elements in attitude control systems and solar panels. The US Space Force's satellite constellation depends on supply chains that trace back to Chinese rare earth processing. Naval vessels use rare earth magnets in electric propulsion systems. Even support equipment, things like radar maintenance tools and field communication systems, incorporate rare earth components. A comprehensive rare earth cutoff wouldn't just slow weapons production, it would degrade the operational readiness of existing military capabilities as components wear out and can't be replaced. Emerging technologies amplify these dependencies. Humanoid robotics, which several major tech companies are developing for manufacturing and service applications, will require rare earth magnets in joint actuators. Data centers, the infrastructure supporting artificial intelligence and cloud computing, use rare earth magnets in high-efficiency cooling systems and backup power generators. As these technologies scale, rare earth demand increases, making the supply chain choke point more severe. Japan and South Korea face particularly acute exposure despite their efforts at diversification. Japanese manufacturers are deeply integrated into global electronics and automotive supply chains. Sony, Panasonic, Toyota, Honda. These companies all depend on rare earth magnets. South Korea's Samsung and LG face similar dependencies. Both countries have invested in stockpiling and alternative supplies since the 2010 crisis, but even their relatively advanced preparation leaves them vulnerable. When China imposed April 2025 restrictions, Japanese automotive suppliers reported magnet shortages within weeks. South Korean electronics manufacturers saw procurement costs spike. The geography of East Asian supply chains, where components cross borders multiple times during production, means that Chinese rare earth restrictions ripple through the entire regional manufacturing ecosystem. Europe faces a different version of the problem. The European Union has committed to ambitious climate goals that require massive expansion of offshore wind and electric vehicle deployment. The EU's Critical Raw Materials Act, passed in 2024, sets targets for reducing import dependence, mandating that 40% of annual critical mineral consumption be processed within the bloc by 2030. These are aspirational targets. As of 2025, Europe has essentially no rare earth processing capacity at commercial scale. Small pilot projects exist. Solvay operates a processing line in France. A magnet facility opened in Estonia in 2025. But these represent a tiny fraction of European demand. The continent remains almost entirely dependent on Chinese rare earth imports. If Beijing decides to restrict European access, either for geopolitical reasons or as leverage in trade negotiations, Europe's green transition stalls. Smaller economies face the most difficult position. Countries that lack the capital and technical expertise to develop domestic rare earth capacity, which is most of the world, have no options except to accept whatever terms China offers for rare earth access. Malaysia, Vietnam, Thailand. These nations host significant electronics manufacturing but have no ability to produce rare earth magnets domestically. They absorb cost increases and supply uncertainty with no capacity to influence outcomes. So who feels the pain? Automotive companies trying to electrify their fleets, wind developers trying to meet renewable energy targets, defense contractors trying to maintain weapons production, semiconductor manufacturers trying to sustain advanced chip output, consumer electronics brands trying to keep costs competitive, countries trying to meet climate commitments, economies trying to maintain manufacturing competitiveness. The answer is basically everyone except China and the few nations that have successfully developed alternative rare earth capabilities, and, as of 2025, that list is vanishingly short. This brings us to the third act. What options remain for countries trying to reduce dependence on Chinese rare earth supply chains? The most obvious path is domestic production, mining rare earths within your own borders and building the processing capacity to refine them to usable purity. The United States has pursued this most aggressively. The Mountain Pass mine in California, which closed in 2002, reopened under MP Materials in 2017. As of 2025, Mountain Pass is the only significant rare earth mining operation in the Western Hemisphere, producing rare earth concentrate from ore that contains high levels of light rare earths like neodymium and praseodymium. But until very recently, MP Materials was shipping that concentrate to China for processing because separation facilities didn't exist in the United States. This created the absurd situation where America mined rare earths domestically and then sent them to a strategic competitor for refining before buying back the finished product. MP Materials has been building separation and magnet manufacturing capacity in Texas with significant Department of Defense support. In July 2025, the Pentagon announced a $400 million investment in MP Materials, including a 10-year offtake agreement where the government commits to purchasing magnets at a price floor of $110 per kilogram, roughly $50 above market price. This subsidy is necessary because MP Materials can't compete on cost with Chinese producers. Chinese magnet manufacturers, backed by cheap rare earth feedstock and decades of process optimization, can sell magnets for $60 to $70 per kilogram. American production, even with automation and efficiency improvements, struggles to break $90. The price floor gives MP Materials revenue certainty and ensures the facility remains operational even if market prices collapse. But there's a scaling problem. MP Materials aims to produce 1,000 metric tons of neodymium iron boron magnets by 2026. That sounds substantial until you compare it to China, which produced approximately 300,000 metric tons in 2024. America's most advanced domestic rare earth magnet facility, supported by hundreds of millions in government funding, will produce less than half of 1% of global supply. It will take years, possibly decades, to scale US production to levels that significantly reduce dependence on Chinese supply. Australia represents the most viable alternative supplier. The country hosts significant rare earth deposits, including the Mount Weld mine in Western Australia, operated by Lynas Rare Earths, currently the only major rare earth producer outside China. Lynas extracts rare earth ore at Mount Weld and ships it to processing facilities in Malaysia, where it undergoes separation and refining. In May 2025, Lynas achieved a milestone by producing commercial quantities of dysprosium oxide, one of the critical heavy rare earths, making it the first company outside China to refine this material at scale. Lynas supplies magnets to Japanese and American manufacturers and has become central to Western supply chain diversification efforts. The US-Australia Framework for Securing Supply of Critical Minerals, signed in October 2025, formalizes cooperation on rare earth development. Under this agreement, American government entities, including the Defense Department and Department of Energy, will take equity stakes in Australian rare earth projects. This represents a shift from traditional procurement, where governments simply purchase materials, to strategic investment, where governments become partial owners of supply chains. The framework includes commitments to accelerate geological mapping, support processing facility construction, and establish stockpiling mechanisms. Japan has pursued a similar strategy, investing approximately $1.5 billion in Australian rare earth operations since 2010. By 2020, Japan had secured roughly 30% of its rare earth imports from non-Chinese sources through these partnerships, but even optimistic projections show Australia facing challenges. Building rare earth processing capacity requires massive capital investment. A commercial-scale separation facility costs upward of $1 billion and takes 5 to 7 years from planning to operation. Lynas's operations in Malaysia have faced local environmental opposition and regulatory challenges. Australia lacks deep expertise in downstream magnet manufacturing, an area where China has decades of refinement. And fundamentally, Australian rare earth production costs more than Chinese production. Without government support willing to absorb cost premiums for supply security, Australian rare earths struggle to compete on price. Recycling presents another avenue, recovering rare earths from end-of-life products rather than mining virgin ore. Rare earth magnets in hard drives, electric vehicle motors, wind turbines, and industrial equipment eventually reach end of life. Recovering the rare earths from these magnets could provide significant secondary supply. The technical challenges are non-trivial. Magnets need to be extracted from complex assemblies, demagnetized, broken down chemically to recover individual elements, and then refined to purity levels suitable for manufacturing new magnets. Several companies are developing recycling processes. REE Cycle in the United States received a $5.1 million Defense Department grant in early 2025 to advance magnet recycling technology that could process magnets from MRI machines, EV motors, and hard drives. European companies are pursuing similar approaches. The European Union's Critical Raw Materials Act mandates that 25% of rare earth supply come from recycling by 2030. This is an aggressive target. As of 2025, rare earth recycling represents less than 5% of global supply. Scaling recycling to meaningful levels requires establishing collection systems for end-of-life products, building processing facilities that can handle contaminated and variable feedstock, and developing markets for recycled rare earth materials. Even if recycling scales successfully, it addresses supply diversity but doesn't eliminate dependence on China for the initial materials that will be recycled decades hence. The wind turbines installed in 2025 won't reach end of life until 2045 or later. EV motors have 15 to 20-year lifespans. Recycling helps long-term but doesn't solve the immediate dependency problem. Some technological approaches aim to reduce or eliminate rare earth requirements. Tesla, for instance, uses induction motors in some vehicles, which avoid rare earth magnets entirely. But induction motors are less efficient than permanent magnet motors, meaning they deliver shorter range for the same battery capacity. Most automakers continue prioritizing permanent magnet designs for their flagship EV models. Wind turbine manufacturers have explored rare earth-reduced designs. Siemens Gamesa and Goldwind have both reduced dysprosium content in their generators to below 1%. Greenspur Renewables developed ferrite-based permanent magnet prototypes that use no rare earths, though these magnets offer lower performance and are still in testing phases. Across industries, the consistent finding is that rare earth magnets remain the highest performance option. Alternatives exist, but with compromises in efficiency, cost, or reliability. Stockpiling provides a buffer, but not a solution. The United States maintains strategic stockpiles of rare earth materials as part of the National Defense Stockpile, but these reserves are measured in months of supply for critical defense applications, not years. Japan has built more substantial stockpiles, particularly of heavy rare earths like dysprosium, but even Japanese reserves would deplete within a year if Chinese supplies were completely cut off. Stockpiling also requires storage facilities, inventory management, and periodic material replenishment to prevent degradation. It's a hedge against short-term supply shocks, not a path to independence. International coordination offers potential through multilateral frameworks. The United States, European Union, Japan, South Korea, and Australia have discussed forming a buyers consortium that could coordinate procurement, share stockpiles, and jointly fund alternative supply development. The idea mirrors OPEC, but in reverse, an alliance of consumers negotiating collectively with the dominant supplier. In practice, these countries have competing interests. Australia wants to maximize revenue from its rare earth exports. The EU prioritizes domestic processing capacity. Japan focuses on supply security regardless of source. The United States balances national security concerns with cost considerations. Coordinating these priorities into coherent policy is difficult, especially when China can offer individual countries bilateral deals that undercut collective action. Diplomatic engagement with China remains the most immediate option, accepting rare earth dependence while negotiating terms of access. This is essentially the path taken in 2025 when the Trump-Xi summit in Seoul resulted in China suspending expanded export controls in exchange for tariff reductions. From Beijing's perspective, maintaining rare earth leverage requires avoiding actions so extreme that Western nations commit fully to building alternative supply chains regardless of cost. China benefits more from controlled dependence, where Western manufacturers rely on Chinese supply, but at prices and terms Beijing can adjust for strategic effect than from total cutoff, which would galvanize a Western response that could erode Chinese market share long term. Some analysts frame this through game theory. China's optimal strategy isn't permanent export restrictions, but periodic demonstrations of control. The 2010 Japan embargo lasted weeks, not years. The 2025 controls were implemented, then suspended. Each episode reminds Western nations of their vulnerability, triggers investment in alternative supplies, but stops short of forcing a complete break. China wants Western dependence to continue, just with the knowledge that access is contingent on Beijing's goodwill. This maximizes Chinese leverage while maintaining market share. From the Western perspective, this creates a frustrating dynamic. Governments pour money into domestic rare earth capacity, knowing that China could always undercut prices, making commercial viability uncertain. Companies hesitate to invest private capital in expensive alternatives when Chinese supply remains available, even if unreliable. The result is a glacial pace of supply chain diversification because the threat of Chinese cutoff never becomes certain enough to justify the massive costs of building truly independent capacity. Time horizons matter here. Expert assessments generally suggest that if Western nations maintain current investment levels in alternative rare earth capacity, significant supply diversity could emerge by 2030 to 2035. Significant meaning. Western sources could supply 25 to 40% of demand, enough to reduce vulnerability but not eliminate dependence. Complete independence, where Western nations can meet all rare earth demand from non-Chinese sources, is unlikely before 2040 at the earliest, and possibly not until mid-century. These timelines assume consistent investment, no major technological breakthroughs, and no deliberate Chinese actions to undermine alternative supply development by flooding markets with cheap rare earths, which China has the capacity to do. The uncomfortable reality is that China spent 40 years building its rare earth empire with patient, strategic investment. Western nations are trying to reverse that dominance in a decade or two. The asymmetry is stark. China controls the current supply chains and has the ability to manipulate prices, making Western alternatives economically unviable unless governments provide subsidies. China also holds much of the technical knowledge and operational expertise that Western nations need to relearn, and China can afford to be patient, maintaining enough market access to discourage drastic Western action while retaining the option to tighten controls whenever strategic interests require. What options remain? Domestic production that costs more and takes years to scale. Recycling that might contribute meaningfully by the 2030s. Technological alternatives that sacrifice performance. Stockpiles that buy months, not years. International coordination that faces political obstacles. Diplomatic engagement that accepts dependence. None of these options provide quick solutions. All of them require sustained commitment and willingness to pay premiums for supply security. The strategic question facing Western policymakers is whether they're willing to treat rare earths as they once treated oil, a commodity so vital that market economics take a back seat to national security. During the 20th century, the United States maintained domestic petroleum production even when Middle Eastern oil was cheaper because energy independence had strategic value beyond cost. If rare earths are treated the same way, then governments will subsidize domestic production, accept higher costs, and commit to long-term investment regardless of market conditions. The US Department of Defense's price floor for MP materials suggests this approach is taking hold in defense applications. Whether it extends to commercial sectors like automotive and wind energy remains uncertain. What's clear as we close out 2025 is that rare earths have become what oil was in the previous century, a strategic commodity whose control confers geopolitical leverage. China holds that leverage now. The fortress is built, the gates are operational, and the rest of the world is only beginning to understand how long it will take to build alternative access routes. The 2025 export controls and their subsequent suspension weren't an isolated incident. They were a demonstration, a reminder that in the transition from fossil fuels to electrification, from old energy paradigms to new ones, the materials that enable that transition have their own strategic geography, and that geography favours Beijing. For anyone investing in the future, for policymakers planning energy transitions, for defence planners ensuring national security, for companies building electric vehicles or wind turbines, the message is unavoidable. The green energy revolution runs through China's rare earth supply chains. Those supply chains can be diversified, alternatives can be built, dependencies can be reduced, but all of that takes time, measured in decades, not years. Until then, rare earths are the new oil, and China is the new Saudi Arabia, with one crucial difference. You can't just discover rare earth processing capacity the way you might strike oil. You have to build it deliberately, expensively, and slowly. The starting gun, fired in 2025. The race is on, but the finish line is still very far away. If this analysis gave you a clearer picture of how critical materials are reshaping global power, if you understand now that the transition to green energy creates its own strategic dependencies, hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the economic and geopolitical patterns that actually determine who wins and loses in the decades ahead. The rare earth story isn't over. It's just beginning. And whether Western nations successfully diversify away from Chinese supply or remain dependent for another generation will define technological competition and strategic balance for the rest of the century.